Zane loved a good scare. He craved adventure. Nothing excited him more than the thrill of the unknown. Whether it was exploring abandoned buildings or camping in supposedly haunted graveyards, Zane was always the first one in. He thrived on the adrenaline rush. Eli, Zane's younger brother, was the complete opposite. Timid and cautious, Eli preferred the comfort of a good book and a warm fire. He admired Zane's bravery but could never understand his brother's fascination with danger. "Why do you do it?" Eli would ask, his voice filled with concern. "Why seek out trouble?" Zane would just grin. "Where's the fun in ordinary, Eli?" he'd say, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Their differences aside, Eli loved his brother. He knew deep down that Zane's adventurous spirit came from a good place, a thirst for life, a desire to experience everything it had to offer. The whispers started long ago. Legends spoke of a dense, ancient forest on the edge of town. The locals called it the Whispering Woods. They said it was a place of shadows and secrets, a place where people went missing and were never seen again. Tales of the woods were like campfire stories passed down through generations. Some dismissed them as mere folklore, but others, those who lived closer to the woods, knew better. They had heard the whispers. One popular story involved a group of teenagers who dared to spend a night in the woods. They were never seen again. The only thing found was their abandoned campsite. Their tent was ripped apart, their belongings scattered. Another tale spoke of a lone hiker who stumbled upon a clearing in the woods. He claimed to have seen shadowy figures circling him, whispering his name. He ran, not stopping, until he reached the edge of the forest. The experience left him shaken and forever changed. The air grew heavy as Zane and Eli drove towards the Whispering Woods. The closer they got, the darker it seemed to become. Even the sunlight seemed hesitant to penetrate the dense canopy of leaves above. "Are you sure about this, Zane?" Eli asked, his voice barely a whisper. He clutched the worn map in his hand, his knuckles white. "Relax, Eli," Zane chuckled, pulling up to the edge of the woods. "It's just a forest. Besides, what's the worst that could happen?" They unloaded the car and shouldered their backpacks. As they stepped into the woods, the air grew noticeably cooler. The sounds of the outside world, birds chirping, leaves rustling in the wind, seemed to fade away. An unnatural silence descended upon them. They walked in silence for what seemed like hours. The forest floor was littered with fallen branches and decaying leaves. The only sounds were their own footsteps and the beating of their hearts. Eli couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As dusk approached, they found a small clearing and set up camp. Zane gathered wood for a fire while Eli pitched the tent. The silence was starting to get to him. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, like the forest itself was holding its breath. "Zane," Eli called out, his voice trembling slightly. "Did you hear that?" Zane paused, his head cocked to the side. "Hear what?" "It sounded like—" "Whispering," Eli said, his eyes darting nervously around the darkening woods. Zane laughed, tossing another log onto the fire. "It's probably just the wind, Eli. Relax." But Eli couldn't relax. The whispering continued, growing louder, closer. It seemed to be coming from all directions at once. And then he saw them. Shadowy figures, lurking just beyond the ring of firelight. They were tall and slender, their forms constantly shifting, making it impossible to get a clear look. Eli's breath caught in his throat. He opened his mouth to warn Zane, but no sound came out. The whispering escalated into a cacophony of voices, calling their names, taunting them. Eli watched in horror as the shadowy figures began to close in, their forms growing more distinct. They were grotesque mockeries of human beings, their limbs elongated and twisted, their faces contorted in silent screams. "Run!" Eli finally managed to choke out, scrambling to his feet. Zane, his face pale but resolute, grabbed Eli's arm and pulled him along. They plunged into the darkness, the sound of their pursuers close behind. Branches whipped at their faces, thorns tore at their clothes. Eli could hear Zane's heavy breath beside him. He risked a glance over his shoulder. The shadowy figures were gaining on them, their eyes burning with a cold, malevolent light. They burst into a clearing, the moon casting an eerie glow over the scene. In the center of the clearing stood a towering figure, more imposing and grotesque than the others. Its eyes, glowing like hot coals, fixed on Zane. Eli's blood ran cold. Section 6. Zane's sacrifice, a desperate attempt. The towering figure lunged for Zane. With a speed that belied its size, it moved like a predator, its clawed hand outstretched. Eli watched in terror as the figure grabbed Zane, pulling him away from him. "Eli! Run!" Zane shouted, his voice strained. He struggled against the creature's grasp, but it was no use. Eli froze, torn between the instinct to flee and the desperate need to help his brother. He couldn't leave Zane. He wouldn't. "Let him go!" Eli screamed, picking up a large rock and hurling it at the creature. It struck the figure in the shoulder, but seemed to have no effect. Zane met Eli's gaze, his expression a mixture of fear and acceptance. "Get out of here, Eli!" he yelled. "Don't look back! Just run!" The creature tightened its grip on Zane, its glowing eyes boring into Eli. Eli knew in that moment that there was nothing more he could do. Zane was right. He had to escape. He had to survive. Section 7. Alone in the darkness. Eli's escape. With a heavy heart, Eli turned and ran. He didn't dare look back. The sounds of Zane's struggles echoed in his ears, fueling his flight. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs screamed for mercy. Thorns tore at his clothes. Branches whipped at his face, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not while those creatures were still out there. Not while Zane. The forest seemed to stretch on forever. The moon, his only guide, cast long, eerie shadows that danced and twisted around him. He had no idea where he was going. He just knew he had to get away from that clearing, from that thing. As the first rays of dawn pierced through the dense canopy, Eli stumbled out of the woods. He collapsed on the side of the road, his body trembling, his clothes torn and bloodied. He had escaped the whispering woods, but at a terrible cost. Section 8. The aftermath, haunted by the whispers. The authorities searched for Zane, but he was never found. Eli told his story, but no one believed him. They dismissed it as shock, as the ramblings of a traumatized teenager. But Eli knew what he had seen. He knew what had taken his brother. He tried to move on, to forget the horrors of that night, but the memories lingered, haunting his waking hours, invading his dreams. The whispers followed him, taunting him with what he had lost. The guilt was a heavy weight on his soul. Eli often found himself drawn back to the edge of the whispering woods. He would stand there for hours, staring into the darkness, listening to the wind rustling through the leaves, imagining he could hear Zane's voice calling out to him, but there was only silence, the heavy, oppressive silence of the whispering woods. Section 9. A Brother's Courage, Remembering Zane. Eli never forgot Zane. He kept his memory alive by telling his story to anyone who would listen. He knew that most people wouldn't believe him, but he had to try. He had to make sure that Zane's sacrifice meant something. He carried the weight of that night with him, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked in the world. But he also carried the memory of Zane's courage, his willingness to sacrifice himself to save his brother, and so the legend of the Whispering Woods continued, a tale of two brothers, a haunted forest, and a sacrifice that would never be forgotten. And Eli, forever changed by his ordeal, vowed to honor his brother's memory by living a life filled with courage and purpose. A life that Zane would have been proud of.